Hi, and welcome to Course Crash. Today we will be talking about new imperialism. For centuries, Europeans had been amazed by the New World. In an attempt to be the most successful nation, each of Europe's major powers began to expand into other continents, specifically the Americas, in order to fuel their economic desires. But as the 19th century rolled around, Europeans began to abandon the New World in favor of Asia and Africa, particularly because they were closer. The non-Western world was seen as an untapped market for manufacturers, potential capital investments, and raw materials for their growing industries. But since the Europeans were unwilling to admit their selfish reasons for claiming this land, they also promoted the idea that civilization could be brought to the non-Western world through enlightenment and liberal universalism. What are you laughing about? New imperialism was now characterized by aggressive expansion of competing European powers. In just a few decades, Europeans essentially conquered all of Africa and vast areas of Asia. Now, the turn of the century was dictated by extreme contradictions, the peak of Europe's global power, and a moment to rethink the scope and future of the empire. Our first topic for today are the transformation of empires in the late 19th century, and our first continent to discuss is Africa. The novel King Solomon's Mines, written in 1885 by Sir H. Rider Haggard, tells of a search of an unexplored region in Africa. It is the first adventure novel. It's set in Africa, and it is the genesis of the Lost World literary genre, inspiring more searches of African land. This eventually led to the Berlin Conference, which was a series of negotiations at Berlin in which the major European nations met to decide all questions connected with the Congo River Basin in Central Africa. This was also known as the Scramble for Africa. The only two countries to maintain their freedom during this time were Abyssinia and Liberia. The continental system came from the Berlin Crisis, as the continental system was a worldwide system of national and colonial oppression of the huge majority of the Earth's population by the imperialist powers, an integral part of all relations of monopolistic capitalism. The Boer War of 1899 was a form of resistance. It was fought between the United Kingdom and the South African Republic. The war ended in victory for Britain and the annexation of both republics. Both would eventually be incorporated into the Union of South Africa in 1910. The Fashoda Crisis was the climax of imperial territorial disputes between Britain, France, and Eastern Africa in 1898. The two armies met on friendly terms, but back in Europe it became a war scare. They eventually agreed upon British control of Egypt and French control of Morocco. The second continent we will talk about today is Asia. Thailand acted as a buffer state between French and British imperialist movements. As a nation, it was never colonized, and it used its status as a buffer to exploit both major powers. In China, on the other hand, there was a lot of conflict. They were involved in the Opium Wars. It was fought between China and Britain, initiated by the Chinese refusal to allow importation of opium from India. China ceded Hong Kong after the British victory in 1842. The British and French victory in the Second War established free trade in Chinese ports and the legalization of the opium trade. Korea and Japan, on the other hand, were involved in the Korea and Sino-Japanese War, which was from 1894 to 95. It was a conflict between Japan and China that marked the emergence of Japan as a major world power and demonstrated the weakness of the Chinese Empire. The war grew out of conflict between the two countries for supremacy in Korea. Our final country for discussion of how imperialism ruined the country is India. The British East India Company was an English company formed for the exploitation of trade with East and Southeast Asia and India, incorporated by royal charter. Starting as a monopolistic trading body, the company became involved in politics and acted as an agent of British imperialism in India from the early 18th century to the mid-19th century.
The Moroccan Crisis of 1905 through 1906. This was an international crisis between March 1905 and May 1906 over the status of Morocco. The crisis worsened German relations with both France and the United Kingdom and helped ensure the success of the new Anglo-French Entente Cordiale. It has been named as one of the causes of World War I. The Great Game. British and Russian concern in the East, especially Afghanistan, became known as the Great Game. French Indochina. France controlled Vietnam, had protectorates in Laos and Cambodia, and had a naval base in North Vietnam.
Our second topic for today is types of colonization. There are 5 main types, the first being the colony. This is when a territory or piece of land is governed directly by a foreign power. The foreign power has the ability to exercise direct or indirect rule. In the case of direct rule, the country is ruled completely by foreign officials with no self-rule to natives. The goal is assimilation of the colony into the empire. The Belgian king Leopold II practiced the most brutal style of direct rule in the Belgian Congo. Almost 10 million Congolese were killed in his entire rule. France was also practiced direct rule of her colonies. Vietnam, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia are notable examples. In the case of indirect rule, sometimes the colony would be governed by foreign officials, while native upper class was given limited self-rule over the colony. The goal was to westernize future leaders of said colony in order to perpetuate a power's control. This was accomplished in Raj, India under the British East India Tea Company until the Sepoy Rebellion. After the rebellion was put down, the British government assumed direct rule over the colony. In a sphere of influence, this is when a foreign power exercises control over another country's trade and economy. China was divided into various spheres of influence by European powers so that they could obtain exclusive trade rights with Chinese ports. Often, Europeans would abuse trade with China because of extraterritoriality rights granted to Europe. The 5th and final type of colonization is economic imperialism. As a relatively hidden form of rule, economic imperialism is practiced when a private company controls a less developed country. Early examples include the Dole Fruit Company controlling Hawaii before it became a state, the East India Tea Company's control of Raj, India, and the Congo Free State's issuing of permits to businesses for exclusive rights to land and people.
Black flags. The Black Flags were rebel detachments of Chinese peasants who had fought against the Manchu authorities until 1868, when they had been forced to flee to Vietnamese territory. Open door policy. Statement of principles initiated by the United States for the protection of equal privileges among countries trading with China and in support of Chinese territorial and administrative integrity. Natural selection. The theory determined by Charles Darwin, the process by which forms of life having traits that better enable them to adapt to specific environmental pressures as predators, changes in climate, or competition for food or mates will tend to survive and reproduce in greater numbers than others of their kind, thus ensuring the perpetuation of those favorable traits in succeeding generations.
Our third topic for today is theories of imperialism. The first is the political theory. This states that imperialism is a balance of power in which major powers try to decrease the strategic and political vulnerability of a nation. Morgenthau was a supporter of the political theory, and he had what was known as a classical realist approach to international politics. Central to Morgenthau's theory was the concept of power as the dominant goal in international politics and the definition of natural interests in terms of power. The second theory of imperialism is the liberal theory. This states that imperialism is used to maintain the existing social order in developed countries. It secures trade and markets, maintains employment and capital exports, and transfers the energies and social conflicts of urban populations into foreign countries. This idea creates a strong sense of racial superiority. One man who supported this theory was Gladstone. He was a liberal British Prime Minister, and he did not believe in expansion of the empire. Another man who believed in this theory was Hobson. He wrote a novel titled Imperialism, a Study. He stood for the most prominent of anti-imperialist theories, and he stated that imperialist powers needed colonies in order to provide new markets for domestic European goods. He also claimed that imperialism only positively affected the wealthy. The third type of imperialist theory is the conservative theory. It states that imperialism is a policy choice, not a consequence of capitalism. It states that increasing concentration of wealth within the richer countries leads to underconsumption for the mass of the people. It also states that overseas expansion is a way to get costs reduced and to secure new consumption. A state can solve the problem of underconsumption by increasing the income levels of the majority of the population, either through legislation concerning wage levels or through income transfers. One man who supported the conservative theory was Disraeli, a British Prime Minister. He was a proactive imperialist that intended to unite the classes. Another man who supported the conservative theory was Rhodes. He was a British businessman and a politician in South Africa. He was an ardent believer in British colonialism and a supporter of conservatism. The third man that supported the conservative theory was Kipling. He was a short story writer, poet, and novelist. He urged the U.S. to take up the white man's burden. The fourth type of imperialist theory is the Marxist theory. This states that imperialism arises because of increased concentration of wealth leads to underconsumption. Since the state represents the capitalist interest, it is not possible to reduce underconsumption effectively through liberal strategies. Ultimately, it was believed the world would be completely divided up and the rich countries would then fight over redivision of the world. This analysis serves as an explanation for World War I. The man who supported this theory was Lenin through his novel Imperialism, The Stages of Capitalism. Our final imperialist theory is the social psychological theory. This states that imperialism is objectless expansion, a pattern simply learned from the behavior of other nations and institutionalized into the domestic political process by a state of warrior class. This warrior class is created because of the need for defense, but over time, the class will manufacture reasons to perpetuate its existence, usually through manipulation of crises. The man who supported this theory was Schumpeter. He wrote a novel, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy.
Eugenics, the science of improving a human population by controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable heritable characteristics. Developed largely by Francis Galton as a method of improving the human race. It fell into disfavor only after the provision of its doctrines by the Nazis. Christian civil satires, a rationale for intervention or colonization, proposing to contribute to the spread of civilization, mostly in reference to the westernization of indigenous peoples. The Europeans would attempt to westernize indigenous peoples in accordance with a colonial ideology known as assimilation. Jingoism, an extreme patriotism, especially in the form of aggression or warlike foreign policy. Over-civilization, to bring out of a savage, uneducated, or rude state, make civil, elevate in social and private life, enlighten or refine. Apartheid, an Afrikaans word meaning the state of being apart. It was a system of racial segregation in South Africa enforced through legislation by the National Party governments.
New imperialism had a lot of effects around the world. For the powers that were colonizing countries, they were pretty great. They got a lot of new resources, and they had a lot more money coming into their country. For the countries that were colonized, it kind of sucked, as you'll see in the other projects. There was a lot of racial superiority and things that happened, and they were awful. But thanks for watching Course Crash. I don't know, that was awful.